Welcome back and welcome to this lecture on fungi. Fungi are really cool. There are a lot of really awesome things to learn about fungi, from their reproductive cycle to their variety, their effects on other organisms. Like, they're very interesting. But in the interest of time, and to allow you guys to have enough time to really review and study the things that we've talked about on plants for your exam, we're just going to keep this lecture pretty surface level. So initially I was going to add in a whole bunch more about fungi and yeast, but instead we'll just keep it brief and give you a good introduction on fungi, just the information that's covered in the latter portions of chapter 14 of your book. So if you find fungi interesting, or if you, after this lecture, feel that it's more interesting and you want to learn more, I do encourage you to go out there and learn more about fungi. They're really interesting in many ways. Additionally, if you're also interested and if you are qualified for it, you can go ahead and take a more upper level biology course that'll cover fungi in more depth. Alrighty, with that said, let's get started on our lecture talking about fungi. Let's start by answering the question, what are fungi? Fungi are eukaryotic organisms, which means that, similar to plants, animals, and protists, they're composed of eukaryotic cells. Fungi make up their own kingdom in the tree of life, and when you compare the kingdom of fungus to the other kingdoms, you'll find that they're most similar to animals. They're more similar even to animals than they are to plants. This means that fungi and animals share a more recent common ancestor than fungi and plants do. These commonalities between fungi and animals are even more apparent when you look on a molecular level, because there's a lot more similarities between fungi and animals than fungi and plants. Most fungi are multicellular, however, some are unicellular, and the unicellular form of fungi we call yeast. And some examples of yeast that you may be familiar with are the ones that are like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is used to make beer. If you ever made kombucha, or if you ever made bread, you'll be familiar with yeast, because all of these products are made using yeast. And yeast is responsible for the production of a lot of very important foods that we enjoy today, as well as the proper functioning of your microbiota. Fungi have a cell wall that's composed of a carbohydrate called chitin. So their cell walls are distinct from plant cell walls, because plant cell walls are composed of cellulose, whereas yeast cell walls are composed of chitin. And chitin is the same carbohydrate that is used by various insects as their outer coating or their outer shell. So there's the same carbohydrate is responsible for both of those structures. Additionally, another characteristic that's unique to fungi is the presence of hyphae. And hyphae are these long thread-like chains of cells that basically make up the vast majority of the fungus body or fungus biomass, and they combine together to form structures called mycelia. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Fungi are sessile, meaning they can't move around, but they are diverse in where they occur. So fungi occur in various areas around the world, including on organisms' bodies, in forests, in wetlands, various places like that. They are restricted in their environments, though, in the fact that they need moisture, and that's just to prevent their cells from drying out. Fungi are heterotrophic, which means that they must eat other organic compounds and organisms in order to get their carbon and survive. Most are decomposers, but some are symbiotes, and then some are parasitic. And then fungi do not undergo photosynthesis. So some can interact with a photosynthetic bacteria or with algae, and these are seen as lichen. So this is actually an example of lichen, but fungi themselves do not undergo photosynthesis. They rely strictly on consuming other organisms to get all their nutrition. Or they, in this case with lichen, they allow the photosynthetic bacteria to live within their tissues and live on them to get some of the carbohydrates from that mutualistic relationship. Fungi are extremely diverse in their shape, size, structure, and habitat, but vast majority of them have been placed into 7 phyla, and of these 7 phyla, The two phyla, Ascomycota and Basidiomycota, contain about 98% of all fungi. So there's a lot of diversity out there, but these two phyla are by far the biggest. The largest living thing on Earth is actually a fungus, and it spreads for miles. So this shows you how kind of resilient and long-lasting fungi can actually be. And some examples of fungi that you may be familiar with are yeast, truffles, morels, mushrooms, mold, and lichen. Fungi are like a two-sided coin. They have some major benefits and then some really bad drawbacks, depending on what species is involved and the conditions that are occurring. So I want to talk about the good, bad, and the ugly of fungi. On the good side, the beneficial side, we have a couple of things. One, nutrition. I don't know about you, but I eat a lot of food that relies on fungi. For one, I eat a lot of mushrooms. I probably eat mushrooms at least 2 to 3 times every week. So mushrooms make up a large percentage of my diet, as well as the diet of various people around the world. But in addition to just eating the fungus straight in the case of mushrooms, you can also have yeast products. So yeast-based products like bread, beer, wine, all those things are based on yeast. And without yeast, it wouldn't be even possible. So nutrition is a major way that we benefit from fungi. Additionally, antibiotics and antimicrobial agents are oftentimes derived from fungi. A major fungus-derived antibiotic that drastically changed the course of human history is the discovery of penicillin. And penicillin was the first antibiotic. It was discovered in the 1920s, and it drastically changed the life expectancy of everyday humans. Before, if you got a cut, that might be a death sentence. But once antibiotics were discovered, the prognosis for people who were ill with a bacterial infection drastically increased, lengthening the possible lifespans of humans. And this penicillin was derived from a fungus, a penicillium fungus. So penicillin is also not the only antibiotic that's been derived from fungi. There are several others out there that we find out of fungi, and then we kind of fine tune them over time to better suit our needs as antibiotics. So they play a major role in the health and well-being of humans and animals as well, like your pets and things like that. Additionally, the interaction between the plant roots and fungi called mycorrhiza is exceptionally important. There are many plants out there that won't even grow if mycorrhiza aren't present. So if they do not have some sort of fungus already inoculated in the soil, these plants won't grow effectively or they won't grow at all. And so mycorrhiza play a major role in our nutrition and our well-being, and as well as the nutrition and well-being of various other animals out there that rely on plants for part of their diet. Also, a huge thing that fungi do is recycling of nutrients and removal of waste. So when an organism dies, if it wasn't for fungi, that organism would just stay there. So we would be up to our necks in leaf litter and rotting rotting plants and old trees and things like that. We really have fungi to thank for breaking down those dead organic matter and recycling those nutrients back into the food web to be used by other organisms for growth. And then last but not least, another benefit for fungi is in our microbiome. So our microbiome is highly composed of bacteria, but it's also composed a lot of fungi in the case of yeast. And so yeast play an important role in how our bodies function as well, and making sure that we're as healthy as we can be. So an important aspect of the microbiota is a happy microbiota equals a healthy person. So those are some good benefits of fungi. On the opposite end, fungi can be quite harmful to animals, including ourselves. I know many people have probably had some sort of fungal related disease within their lifetimes. These fungal related diseases as a whole are referred to as mycoses, and they include everything from athlete's foot to thrush to ringworm. There are a variety of illnesses that are caused by fungi. And in addition to just the normal pathogenic fungi, if your body gets out of whack, if your immune system is a little bit off or depressed, then the fungi that help make up your microbiota, like the yeast in your body, can actually also make you sick. So this is the reason why women will often get yeast infections, and then you can get babies and adults will get thrush in their mouths, is due to an overgrowth of yeast in and on the human body. So they can be harmful as well as helpful. Uh, the fungi can also cause problems when it comes to buildings. If there's a lot of moisture, you can end up with toxic molds. And so you can see here is an example of mold that's kind of formed in a wall. This is why it's important, if you suspect that there's a leak anywhere in any of your piping or anything, or if you experience frequent flooding, to try to get a handle on those things, because mold will generate wherever there's lots of moisture, including in your refrigerator. So make sure to keep an eye for these fungi, because they do produce spores, and those spores, and sometimes they produce toxins as well, can make you very, very ill when you breathe them in or interact with them, and can even cause birth defects and death in people. So keep an eye out for that. Additionally, there are a lot of different parasitic fungi out there that a good example of this that I always find to be really interesting are the cordyceps, and they are interesting to me because they can cause some insects to become zombie insects. So you can see that up here. This is actually a picture of, I think it's like an ant or a bee, but you can barely even tell that it is one, because all of these little spikes are actually a fungus growing out of this organism. And so if you want to find out more about cordyceps, I've included a video at the end of this presentation from the BBC that shows you a time lapse of a cordyceps growing out of the head of an ant. There's thousands, hundreds of species of cordyceps out there that are parasitic, but there are also a lot of different other parasitic fungi out there, like we were just talking about, the ones that cause ringworm or jock itch or your athlete's foot. Those are also parasitic fungi. Next, we'll talk about the general life cycle of a fungus. However, before we do that, there are a couple terms that I want to make sure that we all understand and are familiar with. So first is hyphae. And so I mentioned in the first slide that hyphae are these thin thread-like chains of fungal cells. And they look something like this, where you have one cell, and this is the nucleus, another cell, which is the nucleus, another cell, another cell. So essentially you just have these long chains of fungus cells that are connected to each other, and they also have pores between these cells that allow for exchange of nutrients and cytoplasmic contents and things like that. But these hyphae will actually interconnect with one another and merge to form something called mycelium. And the mycelium are actually the vast majority of the fungus. Mycelium generally go unseen. They lie underground or within the tissues of whatever they're decomposing. So you can't really see them unless you're, take a sample and then look under like a microscope or something like that. But the vast majority of the life cycle of a fungus is actually in this kind of invisible to our naked eye mycelium form. And then the other term that's important to know is mushrooms. So I know you guys probably like, oh yeah, I know what a mushroom is, but a mushroom is actually the reproductive structure of the fungus. So it's the fruiting body. It's the part that's responsible for making the spores so that they can reproduce sexually. So when you see a fungus, like with your actual eye, when you're walking down the street and you see a mushroom growing, that's not it. The mushroom is just what we can see, and it's something like, let me see, I'll draw one. Let's say you're traveling along and you see this mushroom. This is not all of the organism. What you don't see is that beneath that mushroom lies a extensive web of mycelium that can go meters away from that location. And they just continually branching in the soil. So just know that when you see a mushroom, that's the fruiting body, the reproductive structure that makes the spores. Fungi can undergo both sexual and asexual reproduction. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the stages in the life cycle and kind of reproduction of fungi. This can vary per species, but the general gist is what we're going to talk about in the next couple minutes. So we're going to start with kind of what we see here is stage one. Stage one, we're starting with two hyphae, which are genetically distinct from one another. And they undergo a fusion event. So when we're looking down at this image here, we see there are two hyphae, one that has red dots in the middle and the other one that has green or bluish colored dots in the middle. And each of those dots is representing a haploid nucleus. And they're different colors because they're genetically different from one another. And they'll undergo a fusion event, creating one cell that will have two haploid nuclei. And this cell is called dikaryotic. And that just basically means that instead of when you think of like a sperm and an egg, you have two haploid nuclei that fuse to form a diploid nucleus. In this case, they do not undergo that fusion. Just the cell's cytoplasms fuse. The two haploid nuclei remain distinct from one another. So each of those cells that are derived from this combined cell will have two separate haploid nuclei. And that's exactly what happens. So this dikaryotic cell will go to elongate to form a mycelium that's also dikaryotic. So every cell in the mycelium has two haploid nuclei. And then basically the mycelium will continue to grow and grow and grow, reproduce and spread. And then once the fungus is ready, it will form a fruiting body structure like a mushroom. And within that fruiting body structure, which is completely composed of mycelium, some of those mycelium will undergo a fusion within their haploid nuclei. So their haploid nuclei will then fuse to form a diploid nucleus. And so that's what they're trying to show you here, that these green cells have undergone nuclear fusion to form a diploid cell, whereas these blue cells here are still dikaryotic and have two separate haploid nuclei. So in those cells that undergo fusion to form a diploid nucleus, they then undergo meiosis to form haploid spores. So for each diploid fused nucleus, they will form 4 haploid spores. And then those haploid spores will then travel via the wind or via some sort of other organism, let's say getting caught in the fur of another animal or something, to a satellite location. And once those spores are in some nice moist soil or under some sort of favorable condition, they will start to undergo mitosis, and you'll end up with these haploid hyphae starting the process all over. So that's the general life cycle of a fungus. As I mentioned before, most fungi are decomposers, or you can say they're saprophytic. That means they get all their nutrients from the decomposition of dead and dying organisms. However, some can be parasitic. For example, ringworm and athlete's foot, well, instead of eating on decaying wood or leaves, they're eating you. They're digesting elements of your own body. So when you think about it that way, it makes it kind of icky. These infections are highly contagious, and this is because they make spores. So we just talked about how the spores are made in the fruiting bodies and they allow for the spread. The same thing happens to us. So if someone has athlete's foot, and they use a public shower without shoes, or even with shoes if they're shedding these spores. And then you go into that public shower and those spores are in that shower. It's a nice, warm, moist environment. Those spores are going to love it in there. And then when they get on your nice, moist, warm body, they're going to love it on you. And so that's how people end up transmitting things like athlete's foot and ringworm from person to person. The fungi undergo extracellular digestion. So what they do is once they land on the substrate that they want, they excrete enzymes from the cell, and then those enzymes then go on to digest organic matter. And then basically once it's digested, it's almost like a nutritive soup, and they just reabsorb the liquid containing all the nutrients, and that's how they feed. All right, you made it to the very end of our short lecture on fungi. Like I mentioned, if you're interested in fungi, if you find this stuff kind of interesting, I recommend going on to YouTube. They have tons of really awesome documentaries on fungi. I watched one not too long ago that looked at the different patterns of the spores. So if you take the tops of the mushrooms and you pat them, you can pat the spores out on a piece of paper, and you can actually look at the distinct species based on their spore pattern. Like that kind of stuff, to me, I'm a little bit of a nerd. It's kind of cool. But if you find that kind of stuff interesting, definitely check those types of things out on YouTube. I've also included some videos here that are related to this lecture on some time-lapse videos of decomposing fruits and the cannibal fungus, which is pretty cool because they disperse their spores in a very unique way. The cordyceps, so the zombie ant fungal infection video, is the cordyceps video from the BBC. And then also a crash course video on fungi as a general overview of some things about fungi. Go ahead and read chapter 14, section 14.13 to 14.16, which is the last couple pages in chapter 14 that we didn't cover before. And so with that said, that's all of the things in fungi. Your exam is coming up on Friday, starting Friday, and then will be available until Sunday at 11:59 p.m. While you're studying, I know it's been a lot of information. There's just some key things I want to make sure that you know. So everything that we've talked about is up for grabs, but if you're trying to figure out how you want to start studying, how to organize your study plan, I would say start with the big picture things and the stuff, the concepts that I spent the most time talking about. So let's list off some things that you should make sure you know as big picture. And then once you know all those things and you feel secure in those, then learn some, the more minor details from the presentations. So make sure you know the difference between the non-vascular plants, the vascular seedless plants, and the vascular plants, the gymnosperms and angiosperms. So know the differences in those, know their differences in replication, the differences between the sporophyte and gametophyte, which part is dominant, which part is not, which plants make seeds, which do not, which ones have vascular tissue, which ones do not, which ones have flowers, which ones have cones. Know all of that information. Also know the difference between the different tissue types in plants. So your ground tissues, know what the parenchyma do, collenchyma and sclerenchyma do. Know what vascular tissues are, what those are, and know the dermal tissues. Know what stomata are and what guard cells are. Know the tissue organizations in roots, in leaves, and the stems. The difference between the organization of tissues in the angiosperms versus, in the monocots versus the dicots. Know those types of things. Know the steps of double fertilization. Know the steps of sperm production and egg production slash central cell production. So what's happening in the ovule, what's happening in the anther. Know those steps on how we make the pollen grain and the ovule. Know the hormones, what kind of hormones are involved in what processes. More specifically, make sure you know auxin. What are some uses of auxin? What are some effects of auxin? But also know what ethylene does and gibberellins, like all those types of hormones. Know what they are and what their effects are on the plant. Know the difference between the apical and lateral meristems and their effects on growth. Know the cell cycle know the life cycle of plants. So be able to explain germination, the major steps in germination, the major steps in growth, the steps in reproduction. Know the fungus life cycle, which we just talked about. Be able to describe the characteristics of a fungus. What makes a fungus unique from, let's say, a plant or an animal? Know fungal nutrition. So how do fungi get their nutrition, and how does that differ from, say, plants? Understand what mycorrhiza are, and make sure you know the anatomy of a flower. So what are all the different parts of a flower, and what do they do? So those are the big concepts, I would say. Make sure that if you're going to start your studying, start there. Make sure you understand everything on those big topics, because that's the vast majority of the things that we talked about, and then go through the more minor things that we discussed. So if you have any questions, of course, come to office hours on Tuesday. I'm going to be there as always. As well, you can come on Thursday if you're available. If you're not available for office hours, of course, you can go see Miranda in her TA sessions. She holds sessions. Please see the announcements page for that, or reach out to her if you need more information. And then you can also go to the STEM Tutoring Center if you want help. And then you can also attend the SI sessions that I posted an announcement on iCollege about last week. So there are a lot of elements for you to get help in here. I know it's a lot of material. Do not wait to the last minute to study. Excellent. With that said, I hope you do well, and I hope this was really interesting for you, especially you guys who really don't care much about plants and fungi. I hope it was at least mildly interesting. Alrighty, see you next week.